Now, let's talk about the risk analysis approaches. So what is risk analysis? Risk analysis is nothing but, like I said before, these two steps here, second and the third step, when you combine these two steps, they become risk analysis, which means you are identifying the vulnerabilities in the assets, identifying the probability and the business impact, and then coming up with certain figures. That is what is meant by risk analysis. Now, when it comes to risk analysis, there are two approaches that you have. First one is a quantitative approach, and the second one is a qualitative approach. So let's first talk about the quantitative approach. So what is a quantitative approach of risk analysis? In the quantitative approach of risk analysis, we use mathematical equations. We use monetary numbers. We use some objective or historical uh, based data to gather certain information. We don't use our judgment. We don't use our intuition. We don't use our experience to see what could happen. Rather, we rely on hardcore numbers. We try to rely on fact as much as possible. So that is what is done under quantitative risk analysis. As it says here, it uses mathematical equations. Now let's see what do we have under quantitative analysis. So when it comes to quantitative analysis, we have got these four numbers which are really important to understand from an exam point of view: exposure factor, single loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence, and annual loss expectancy. So these are the four terms that you must understand very well, especially from a CISSP perspective. Okay, so let's go through these terms one by one. Exposure factor. What is EF or exposure factor? Exposure factor is nothing but a percentage of loss for an asset on a realized threat, which means that if a certain threat were to actually happen, were to actually materialize, then what will be the loss for a specific asset? What will be the percentage of loss for that specific asset? Okay, so let's take a look at this example. It says if a flood were to occur, then that would stop the production at a factory at the ground floor, leading to 20% loss. Okay, so you say that that a flood could happen because the factory is located at such a location where there is a possibility of flood. So that is a threat, right? Now, if that flood were to occur, then there is a chance that the production at the ground floor of that factory will stop. Now, what will that mean in terms of the business impact? Which means that you could say that there will be a 20% loss to the production. So 20% is your exposure factor. So EF for the factory would be 20%. Now remember that it is always in percentage. Okay, so if you see a question in the exam where they are presenting you exposure factor, but which is not in the form of a percentage, that means that will not be the right option. So exposure factor is always the in percentage. It is because, as it says here, it is the percentage of loss for an asset if a threat were to actually materialize, were to actually be realized. Okay, that is exposure factor. Next term is SLE, single loss expectancy. Single loss expectancy means the loss from a single event if a risk were to materialize. So if a threat were to materialize one time, then what will be the loss from that single event? How will you calculate that? The way to calculate SLE is to take the exposure factor and to take the asset value and multiply these two numbers. Okay, so in the previous example, we saw that in the previous this is a different example now. So it says if a factory has an asset value of $1 million. So let's say you have a factory and you figure out that the value of that factory is $1 million, and you see that there is a threat of fire. So if fire were to happen, then that could cause a 30% damage. Okay, so 30% is what? 30% is the exposure factor, right? And what is the asset value here? Asset value here is $1 million. So how do you calculate the SLE, single loss expectancy? You multiply AV, asset value, with exposure factor. That gives you a value of $300,000. Okay, so that will be your single loss expectancy. It means that what will be the loss from a single event if that threat or if that risk were to actually materialize. Okay. Next, we talk about ARO, or annualized rate of occurrence. Now, ARO means what is the estimated frequency of a threat taking place in 1 year? Because threats do not materialize every single year, right? Or they may materialize, but how many times will they materialize based on your experience or based on certain data? How many times can you expect a certain threat to materialize in 1 year? Because mostly we prepare annual plans, right? So we always want to see what could happen in that specific year. So what is ARO? ARO is the estimated frequency of a threat taking place in 1 year. For example, if it is estimated that a flood is likely to occur 2 times in 1 year, then 2 would be the ARO. Similarly, if it is estimated that a fire is likely to occur once in 10 years, then ARO will be 0.1 because you divide 1 by 10. So annualized rate of occurrence is nothing but estimated frequency of a certain threat taking place in 1 year. That is ARO. Now we understand SLE, right? We just saw what SLE is, single loss expectancy. But like I was saying, that mostly we prepare annual plans. So we want to understand what is the annual loss expectancy, not SLE. We want to know what ALE can we expect for certain threats. So it is the estimated annual loss. And how do you do that? You calculate the SLE first, and then you calculate the ARO, which is annualized rate of occurrence. You multiply those two figures, and what you get is ALE. So, uh, going by the previous example, if SLE for a fire at a factory is $300,000, that means if the fire were to happen once, then we are expecting the loss of the factory to be 300,000 for one event of fire. Okay. Now, the ARO for the fire occurring is once in 20 years because fire will not happen every year. So maybe based on some historical data or some other analysis, you figure out that there is a probability that the fire could occur once in 20 years. So what will be the ARO here? Annualized rate of occurrence, that will be 1 divided by 20, which will give you 0.05. So what will be the ALE in that case? ALE will be your SLE, which is 300,000. You multiply that with ARO, which is 0.05. So you get 15,000. So 15,000 will be your annualized or annual loss expectancy. Okay. So that's ARO, SLE, exposure factor, and ALE. Important terms to understand for the exam. Those formulas that we just saw, they come under quantitative analysis, right? Because like I was saying, in quantitative analysis, we are trying to be as objective as possible. We are not trying to be subjective. Whereas qualitative is the opposite of quantitative, where we are not basing our decisions based on hard facts or based on hard numbers like monetary figures or using any formulas as such. Rather, qualitative analysis is based on judgment, people's opinion, based on their experience and intuition. Okay. It does not use mathematical formulas. Some techniques that come under qualitative analysis are Delphi technique, group discussion, brainstorming, storyboarding, surveys. So you bring people from different departments together, and you can ask them for their own opinion on what they think could be the risk on a certain vulnerability for a certain server, and how well a certain control could perform in a certain category. And then you can take a look at all those opinions, maybe give them some numbers as well if you want, and then come up with some result. Okay. Because quantitative can be very, very hard to do if you have to do a quantitative analysis for every single risk or every single asset, right? Because it involves a lot of calculations. So if you are trying to do it manually, it will take a very, very long time. So a lot of times qualitative is preferred over quantitative, but it depends on scenarios, different scenarios. Okay. So that is qualitative.